welcome everybody to this series, The Torch of Progress. This is the speaker series associated with our online high school summer program called Progress Studies for Young Scholars. Progress Studies for Young Scholars is an online summer program in the history of technology, inspired by this concept of progress studies and aiming, which we'll be talking to Patrick about, and aiming to give students at the high school level and up a sort of foundation in the history of technology and the history of economic growth in order to really understand what progress studies is all about and pursue it. We have got some great events coming up. We're doing a fantastic speaker every week. The past ones, by the way, are on our YouTube channel. If you look on the YouTube channel for Progress Studies for Young Scholars, you will find interviews with Tyler Cowen and our very own Matt Bateman. Coming up next week, Wednesday, June 24th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, we have Max Roser, who's the founder of Our World in Data. The week after that, we will have Deridre McCloskey on Thursday, July 2nd, also 10 a.m. Pacific, I'm pretty sure. And the week after that, we will hear a talk actually from Joel Mokyr on Wednesday, July 8th at 10 a.m. And there will be a lot more scheduled after that. We are still lining folks up. You can see who some of the speakers are on the Progress Studies for Young Scholars website, and those dates will be announced. Last week, by the way, Tyler Cowen said that there are the two people who he thinks know the most about the Industrial Revolution are Dr. McCloskey and Dr. Mokyr. So those should be some really interesting conversations. I am your host, Jason Crawford. I write The Roots of Progress, which is a website with essays and notes about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress. And our guest today is Patrick Collison. Patrick is the co-founder and CEO of Stripe, one of the most successful technology startups of the last decade or so. He is also a co-founder, I'll call you, of Fast Grants for COVID-19 research, which hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about. And Stripe is also sponsoring books for Progress Studies for Young Scholars. I have one of them. So this just came out from Stripe Press. It is Richard Hamming's The Art of Doing Science and Engineering. And every student, or the first 100 students to enroll in Progress Studies for Young Scholars, will get a copy of that and or a copy of Dream Machine, the biography of JCR Licklider. So thank you very much to Stripe and Stripe Press for sponsoring that. Patrick, welcome. And do you want to just tell us a thing or two that's cool about Stripe? I don't know what you share publicly, but like if you can tell us your revenue or your your market cap or your or how many amazing customers you have or whatever it is that you tell people to tell them how awesome Stripe is in case people don't know, and maybe what it is, since I haven't mentioned that. And we're not hearing you. You're muted, so go ahead and unmute. Technology, I know it's hard.
All right, there you go. I think I need your permission. All right, Stripe. Well, first off, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for organizing the series. Just your mention of Joel Mokyr, I presume many of you have already read A Culture of Growth, but if you have not, I really strongly encourage it. I mean, all of Joel Mokyr's work is great, but that book in particular really stands out to me. Stripe is an online payment system, or at least we started out as that, and now we're building a whole host of functionalities sort of besides. So in really simple terms, you can imagine you want to accept a credit card payment over the internet. We try to provide the best and easiest to use system for doing that. Really, we think of ourselves as building a broader programmable system for moving money on a global basis. And so kind of as the world is increasingly moving to coordinating its economic activity through software, you need some kind of system, some platform that you can ask to move money on your behalf, because you're probably not going to go build all the infrastructure that you need to do that yourself in-house. So something kind of like AWS for the movement of money. And we started doing that about 10 years ago. We now have millions of customers, and while our revenue is not public, in as much as you can trust Silicon Valley venture capitalists, which is clearly not completely, but our nominal valuation at least was, I guess, most recently $36 billion. But we don't. I mean, for us, valuation is sort of not that relevant, at least in the short-term metric. Really, what we care about is that we're able to be a catalyst for, and hopefully an accelerant of, economic opportunity. and economic activity more broadly. A metric that we care a lot about and we sort of try to assess as best we can is what's our counterfactual significance. We talk about the idea of growing the GDP of the internet, and so we often ask businesses, do you think you would exist if Stripe didn't? Or for companies that incorporate with Atlas, which is a system we have for incorporating, we ask, would you have started your company if Atlas did not exist? And we're always sort of in our product development trying to think about, well, what can we build and what can we do that causes activity to happen that would not in fact otherwise occur?
Excellent. All right. Thanks for that introduction. Let's dive right in to some big topics, and let's talk about research and development. Actually, so I'd like to ask you about fast grants. So a couple of months ago, you launched, along with some others, launched this program, Fast Grants for COVID-19 Research. It's been, what, at least 2 months since then.
Yeah.
Give us an update. What has happened? What have you learned from it? Will it become something permanent? Will you scale it? What does the future look like?
Okay, so where fast grants came from is we realized back, backtracking even more, like many of us, in February we were paying attention to COVID, and so the data seemed quite concerning. March came and it was the concerning cases were in fact obviously really happening, not only in China but in many more places besides. And by April, it felt that, man, if only we had listened to maybe our sort of rational faculties in January or February, we might have more actively prepared for this. By April, it felt that things were already the pandemic was really quite bad, and we were already too late in our response. And so then we started to kind of ask ourselves, this is me, Tyler, and my partner, Silvana, who's a professor at Stanford. We started asking ourselves, well, if we were to do something, what might be effective? We realized that the NIH and the NSF and a lot of other the NIH and the NSF are obviously the leading scientific grant-making entities in the US. There are many other kind of private foundations that are also themselves very active. We realized that these government bodies especially, but also many of these sort of private bodies are really not adapted to doing things quickly. I think they support a lot of really good work, but they're not good at responding when speed is of the essence. And so we actually reached out to the NIH and the NSF to try to get a sense for what it was that they were doing to respond to this pandemic that is setting back global civilization. I think it's sort of not hyperbolic to say. And we were struck, and this is actually kind of public, back in April, if you just search the NIH's public database for how many COVID or coronavirus grants had been made as of the time, I think the number as of April was 12 or something like that. And so we realized that it may actually be possible because so few organizations are suited to moving quickly to do something that would enable and unlock scientists to get started more quickly, to run trials more quickly, to test potential new drugs more quickly. So a week after this idea, we launched Fast Grants. Initially, I think at launch with $12 million, some of which myself and my co-founder John provided, some of which was, in fact, the majority of which was provided by third-party donors. They have subsequently been joined by a significant number of other donors. Within, I don't remember the exact details, but within about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, we'd made on the order of 100 grants. And so I think I don't want to definitively claim this, and in fact, I hope we're wrong, but we became, as far as I know, the leading funder, at least by number of grants of COVID science in the world. And these were really top scientists. When we published our open call, we received 4,000 applications within the first week. As many of you know, if you ever put up an application on the internet, where anybody can apply, 50% plus of what you get won't be that good. We were astonished. The vast majority of the applications, like let's say at least 3,000 of them, were very sensible, very plausible, perhaps even plausibly worth funding. And so Fast Grants entailed a promise to respond with a definitive funding decision 48 hours subsequent to the application. So we had some pretty intense reviewing to do, which Silvana, my partner, led along with a cohort of other volunteers. Anyway, so we made the grants. They're now off to the races, and we actually are just in the process of receiving their kind of second month of updates. And it's proving really encouraging. There are really promising drug candidates already developed. There are things that are already moving to trials. There are vaccine candidates, and so if one posits or accepts that COVID is one of the sort of greatest threats to progress in this calendar year, we're happy to be able to do something small but hopefully helpful on the margins.
And what have you learned from fast grants? What's been most surprising or unexpected for you?
Well, a big lesson in general is I started out in rural Ireland, and so I kind of felt far from sort of where things were happening, and I guess I sort of assumed that in the places where things are happening, really enlightened people are making really enlightened decisions, and are, just the adults are in charge. Again and again, over the last, I guess through my adulthood, I've learned the lesson that there's nobody behind the curtain. And I think that's simultaneously good and bad news, in the sense that it's bad news in the sense that, if you want to rely on, super smart people taking care of things that you might think are a really big deal, that you should not assume that they exist. It's good news in the sense that I think you can upgrade your estimation of your own potential impact, if you choose to pursue one of these things. And I don't understand at all dismissive of other efforts that are taking place, or, self-aggrandizing for fast grants. Like, others did and would eventually have acted, and we'll see sort of in the sort of over time how much fast grants appears to have actually mattered. But at least as of April, it sure seemed that the set of people who were committed to moving really quickly to actually acting on supporting and funding the top scientists in the world to solve our top medical challenge was actually exceptionally small. And in fact, Berkeley published an article now about maybe a month ago saying that they'd applied to, or Berkeley scientists had applied for all kinds of repurposings of existing NIH grants they already had. They, at the time, had not heard back to any of those applications, but again, as of the time, I think 4 or 5 Berkeley scientists, maybe even more, had been funded by fast grants. And so I guess this was a very potent example of this broader curtain phenomenon, but by no means the only one.
Yeah. The great corporate research lab, like think Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, is that a thing of the past? Has it sort of already seen its heyday? Yeah. And if so, was that natural? Like, is there something new we should be moving on to, or should we be trying to bring that back?
Yeah, I wonder about that a lot. And obviously there are kind of various theories on it. One thing that I think is underemphasized in many of these histories, and while there are a few good histories, I always wish there were more ones that were somehow kind of more systematic. Those that exist tend to be sort of very, narrative and kind of anecdote oriented, and those are valuable, but they're somehow insufficient. One thing that I think is underemphasized is they competed on the basis of compensation. Like, they just paid more than other potential sources of employment. And so, for example, PARC, their strategy for aggregating the best computer scientists in the world was to pay them more than they would have been earning in academia. And in the 70s, you weren't going to go work at Google and earn millions of dollars a year, because there were no Google. Silicon Valley hadn't really sort of left the launch pad. And I think to a certain extent, to a significant extent, the same thing applies to Bell Labs. And certainly Bell Labs was quite explicit that their strategy was, again, to compensate really well and to present sort of more favorable employment than maybe alternatives within academia. And so I think there's a question as to whether that's in fact possible today. It could be the case that because there are so many kind of high return loci for super talented people to go and deploy their talents, that you can never quite aggregate to the same extent or in the same way. The counter argument obviously would be that, well, maybe there was a kind of thinking, maybe a sort of ambition, maybe a willingness, in monopolies like Bell Labs or excuse me, like Bell or Xerox, to pursue things sort of substantially outside their domains. Maybe we're somehow lacking that style of thinking, and there's been some academic literature trying to make some of those cases. My guess is that it's somewhere in between. It does feel to me that you just could not do PARC in the sense of, I don't think you could aggregate the best computer scientists in the world anywhere today. There were just sort of too many places competing for those top tier individuals. But it does simultaneously seem strange that that it's hard to think of any major successes from these kinds of labs over the last 10 or 15 years, and we'll see to what degree Google ends up supplying some of these. I mean, obviously they've attempted some sort of similarly ambitious efforts, and time will tell, if they end up in that illustrious set.
Yeah. So, suppose you were asked to write a report on the future of science and research in this country, like the Endless Frontier Memo that Vannevar Bush created in 1945. What would you say in summary?
I mean, it's funny. I've huge admiration for Bush, and yet I also think that the Endless Frontier sort of, in a sense, sowed the seeds of the destruction of, well, that's kind of hyperbolic and exaggerated, but by proposing a centralized federal agency, actually creates some very kind of pernicious incentive structures and dynamics. And the main thing that I would do if writing such a report today is to argue for kind of heterogeneity, decentralization, and competing approaches. I don't know what the best approach is in a kind of singular sense. I don't know that it's knowable, and I suspect that it does not even exist. And whatever it is will in fact kind of evolve through time. And so, first order, I'd probably say that there should be, at least 10 bodies. You should have some kind of mechanism that incentivizes them to pursue approaches that are in fact substantially different. And then sort of assess the right time horizon, where on the one hand, you do sort of reallocate capital to those which are proving more and less successful. And there is in fact an incentive to perform well. But simultaneously, that can't be excessively short-term oriented, because for science it's simply too hard to assess the results. It's worth noting that federal funding of science, or federal funding being kind of the predominant funding source, is a fairly recent phenomenon. That only became the case in the second half of the 20th century, sort of toward the 60s and 70s. And before then, it was far more diversified, far more variegated. You had industrial sources, you had state sources, you had scientists, kind of quasi-entrepreneurs themselves, sort of soliciting funding from all sorts of locals and sort of immediate their immediate surrounds. And the federal government getting more closely involved was actually quite controversial. And many scientists at the time opposed it, I think accurately foreseeing that much of the sort of the kind of hegemonic effects that in fact have transpired would be second order problems, meaning the first order effect might not be as beneficial as expected.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm coming to some similar conclusions myself. The more I study sort of the history of research and how it's evolved. You mentioned metrics and sort of how we measure this stuff. So that's a good segue into another thing I wanted to ask you, which is, if you had to give society like a progress KPI, or maybe a small set of KPIs, and for those who aren't into the business lingo, that stands for key performance indicator. What's on your, if you were running progress for the world or for the country, what does your dashboard look like? What are the key metrics on there?
I mean, while all of the critiques of GDP and GDP per capita are valid, I think, if one just had to choose a single metric, I really think GDP is pretty good. Like I redid this analysis recently. Like I think the sort of the correlation between GDP per capita and self-reported happiness is like 0.76. And GDP against life expectancy is even higher. It's about 0.8. And so if you like a sort of some kind of true believing product manager, if you were just to reduce to a single metric, I think that would not be a bad one. Having said that, it is clearly kind of too simplistic for a complete dashboard. I guess, okay, you want metrics around the way I sort of imagine the kind of production function of I guess, progress is there's some set of characteristics of the culture. To some degree, that applies to kind of the culture in a broad sense. To some degree, it might apply to the culture of certain subgroups, certain kinds of individuals, and so on. You know, a separate thing that I believe about progress is that many of the relevant dynamics are actually less about individuals and more about the dynamics of small groups and sort of really productive clusters of individuals. And certainly that's kind of what you tend to see in the past. And we can come back to that a little bit if you like. So anyway, I would think a lot about sort of how does one assess culture? I mean, clearly you sort of the degree to which culture supports heterodoxy, the degree to which culture welcomes views that differ to its preconceptions. That worked well for for the Dutch, for the Scottish, for the English, in sort of various ways, imperfectly. But I think those were kind of part of the preconditions for much of the growth that ensued. So stuff about culture. Is kind of second, and importantly, about just like basic liberal values in that sort of, can anyone's ideas be taken seriously, or do we have all sorts of kind of biases and preconceptions that sort of exclude various individuals from the outset? Secondly, metrics about the scientific process. We were just discussing that a little bit, but I would really think hard about what will we look at to tell to what degree the scientific process is working. And actually, Michael Nielsen and I wrote this piece. Some of you are probably familiar with it, about sort of the dynamics of sort of progress in science. And I don't know that we came up with any metrics that should make that dashboard on an ongoing sense, but I do think that if we as a society and a civilization really care, take science seriously, I think we should be thinking about how to tell whether it's getting kind of more or less healthy, or how we should even start to kind of think about that question. So anyway, stuff about science, stuff about entrepreneurship, which I see as kind of the deployment sort of mechanism for much of the discoveries of science. And I don't think those are kind of fully disjoint in that, often the discoveries of entrepreneurship sort of feed back into science in some way, and so there's kind of codependency. But it is, I think, certainly noteworthy that the locations that tended to be sort of to foster entrepreneurship in the domain of ideas also tended to foster kind of actual business entrepreneurship as well. And then I'd probably look at maybe economists talk about sort of looking at, you can look at sort of inequality by wealth or by income. You can also look at inequality in terms of consumption. And I guess I would probably be interested in looking at sort of consumption inequality or consumption kind of metrics of maybe, the top 1% and the median person, or the bottom 25% or percentile or something, in the sense that I think the top 1% or, some number close to the top gives you kind of intensive progress, like kind of is anyone getting better off in a really material way, and then at the median or again choose your other percentile, you tell, okay, well, how effectively are we actually distributing it, and both of course are important. So roughly speaking, I think that's how I'd structure it. But I would actually, I would love to read any blog post on this topic of what should that dashboard look like, and I'm sure I'm forgetting things that once I read them I think, man, that's very obvious and totally true.
Great. Okay. Well, if I run across anybody who has a blog about progress, I will let them know that you would like to.
I know of one very good
one. Okay. You mentioned in particular science and sort of measuring science, and is science slowing down? You and Michael Nielsen had your contribution to this in The Atlantic. One of the metrics that people use to sort of argue that science is slowing down is this kind of like research productivity measured as, to keep Moore's law going at like a constant percentage improvement each year, we have like this exponential growth in the number of researchers and research dollars. So that's sort of one argument that science is slowing down. Scott Alexander had this sort of counter post, and his take on it was, quote, "Constant progress in science in response to exponential increases in inputs ought to be our null hypothesis." So what do you think on this issue?
Yeah, so sorry, Michael and I actually debated this question quite a bit. And first off, my recollection is that in Scott's post, he actually acknowledges that that kind of conflicts to some extent with what we've seen, where that sort of implies a kind of singularity where, as we require exponentially, increasing inputs, then at a certain point, we obviously sort of can no longer sustain that. And so you would then expect a kind of asymptote in in realized progress. And that obviously isn't what we've in fact seen. And of course, if you look at sort of log GDP per capita over time in the US, it looks sort of really shockingly constant. And so I guess my first view is that either there's a significant anomaly there where, the prior that Scott thinks we should have conflicts with the realized data. Or, maybe you might say that, well, we actually have been increasing inputs exponentially and, it's just about to run out in the not too distant future. That could be true. But again, if that is our prior, then I think we actually need to revise the other prior we have, which is, I think that the world is going to get better at a constant-ish rate. I think that is sort of the base expectation among people. And you could have, a more sort of Nietzschean view that actually, it's either going to stop or, I guess if it stops with current economics, at least, then it's probably in fact going to sort of crash, because I'm not sure that, other, distribution mechanisms we have can sustain an economy without growth. So again, I think if he's right, I think it actually has pretty material additional consequences that we'll have to start really reckoning with. As to whether that in fact should be our prior, I guess I sort of disagree, and I always think that I should probably try to sketch out that argument in more detail, and I think there are probably some useful geometric intuitions there. But obviously, the basic point is that, and many people, Romer, Jones, and others have kind of made it, is, what is interesting about and important about ideas is they can in principle be instantly deployed to produce some kind of gain across an arbitrarily large economy. And so, when you discover, penicillin or ibuprofen or whatever, as either an individual or a very small group did, those are no less significant as a result of, being deployed across, larger groups of people or larger economies. And so there is, I think, a kind of scale invariance to knowledge. And, you would, again, I think part of the intuition difference comes from, are you imagining sort of particular sigmoids, or are you imagining, sets of sigmoids, and like, how does the evolution, like, what are the characteristics of the set of possible sigmoids and so on? And, that all sounds kind of super abstract, but I suspect it can be made to a little bit more concrete. But I guess my kind of short answer would be that I'm not convinced that should be our prior. And I think in as much as it is, it actually predicts other things that substantially conflict with the worldview that I think most other people have, and potentially the data we've seen so far.
That's interesting, because I thought it was actually matched to the data, and maybe I'm not understanding it right. But let me actually drill in on this a bit with a bit of an analogy. Like, so if you look at the growth of a company, and I'm going to just guess that the following applies to Stripe as an example, and you measured sort of employee productivity as like the percent increase in revenue, divided by the number of employees that you have. Typically, companies, if they're doing really well, they're growing at exponential rates of revenue, but they're also hiring employees like exponentially. So like by the exact same metric and by the exact same logic, you would say we have declining employee productivity at our company, even as we're growing exponentially, because we have to grow our employee base exponentially in order to keep growing our revenue exponentially. Well, isn't that essentially the same thing?
I think the relevant question, or comparison rather, would be, the growth rate of aggregate startup market cap per startup employee over time. Like Stripe is a single idea, so to speak, or at least a small bundle of them. And so I think we're more analogous to scaling a particular drug, or a particular drug family or something. And I mean, I think it is empirically true that any approach is very well. We'll necessarily see eventually diminishing returns yielding some kind of S curve. And so yeah, I think you'd have to look at the sort of the employee productivity statistics across the entire sector. And I don't know where you'd necessarily get the data to do that, but if that was feasible, I think that'd actually be super interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I want to move on to some other topics. What do you think about, so compare and contrast effective altruism movement with progress studies. And I would love to hear you comment, as part of this, comment on the notion of existential risk or global catastrophic risk.
On EA, well, I think with a lot of things, actually, in assessing them, or with anything that's a kind of, totalizing framework, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean that, like, what, in principle, everyone could have an EA mindset, and I'm sure at least some EA members think that everyone should have an EA-oriented mindset. So you can then sort of ask the question of, well, would it be good for everyone to have an EA mindset? But of course, the other way of asking it is like, well, is EA on the current margin a good new way for people to be thinking? And would it be good, instead of 0 people, before the EA movement, to be thinking in EA-oriented fashion? Would it be good for 5% of people or for 10% of people to be thinking that way? And in the latter sense, like, was it a good shift on the margin? I think EA has been great, and I'm sort of delighted that they've that they have had the progress they've had. If the question is, well, kind of, should everyone be an EA, or even, I guess, in the individual sense, am I, or do I think I should be an EA? I think, and obviously there's kind of heterogeneity within the field, but my general sense is that, I mean, the EA movement is obviously very focused on kind of on rigid, not rigid, that's unfair perhaps, but on sort of estimation, analytical, quantification, and sort of utilitarian calculation. And I think that as a practical matter means that you end up too focused on that which you can measure, which again means, or as a practical matter means, you're too focused on things that are sort of short term. Bed nets or deworming or whatever being kind of obvious examples. And like, are those good causes? I would say almost definitely yes. Obviously now we've seen some new data over the last couple of years that maybe not as good as they initially seemed, but like they're very likely to be really good things to do. But it's hard for me to see how, writing a treatise of human nature would score really highly in an EA-oriented framework, and yet, as assessed ex post, that looked like a really valuable thing for Hume to do. And similarly, as we kind of look at the things that in hindsight seem like very good things to have happened in the world, it's often unclear to me how an EA-oriented intuition might have caused somebody to do so. And so I guess I think of EA as sort of like a metal detector in the sort of in the backyard of good things to do, and they've invented a new kind of metal detector that's really good at detecting, some metals that other detectors are not very good at detecting. But I actually think we need some diversity in, the different metallic substances, to which our detectors are tuned, and for me, it would not be the only one.
Good metaphor. And what about the particularly sort of concerns about global catastrophic risk or existential risks, especially from technology? This is where I get sort of the most, I won't even say pushback exactly, but concern from people about progress study is the question of, well, if we're just run full throttle ahead with progress, what about the risk of that, we're just not careful enough and we get some global catastrophe?
Well, I think it is probably true that the optimal rate of technological change is not, that it is not kind of monotonically better the more that there is. There probably are kind of sheer forces with society at a certain point. I think there's a question as to, as a practical matter, should our concern be having too much or having too little? And actually, but I should say, I don't want to conflate progress studies with purely technological advancement, but it's clearly a significant part of it. Generally, I think, well, looking historically, I think that too little has been a problem far more frequently than too much. I think today, in many super obvious ways, we have too many lives are not as good as they obviously could be. And so in a very tangible sense, we have too little progress. And I think there are very valid ways in which one could imagine having too much. But I guess, I feel sort of, for every 1 unit of concern I give to too much, I give sort of 4 or 5 to, we have too little. Now, there is an asymmetry there where the existential risks are kind of by definition existential. I thought Toby Ord's book was a great contribution. And broadly, I think the existential risk folks, again, have introduced a good line of thinking that we really should be taking seriously. I suspect that it's possible to mitigate most of those risks relatively effectively without redirecting vast swathes of society. And I think the more difficult problem will actually be, how do we generate enough?
Yep. This is a good segue to one of the last questions I want to ask you. I've got 2 more, and then we'll go to questions for the audience. So your Twitter bio describes you as fallibilist, optimist. What do those terms mean, and why did you choose them to describe you?
The first thing that came to me when the bio fields appeared in front of me, but I guess fallibilist. The thing that I like about it is,
what does it mean? Can you just?
Okay. The notion that you're never going to be perfectly right, and that you are always seeking. You are aware that your mental models and explanations and theories are always wrong. Accepting and maybe even embracing, although I guess a strict reading of the term does not imply embracing, the fact that you're engaged in this ongoing process of error correction. In David Deutsch's, who's done some work to kind of popularize this term, he emphasizes, I think, a lot of his thinking is derived from Karl Popper. And I don't know that he ever materially differs from Popper, but he does place emphasis in kind of different ways. I really like the weight that he places on explanations as the kind of focal point for kind of what we are or sort of should be engaged in. And there's a lot of he talks about sort of it's easy to get into a kind of justificationist mindset where you're always seeking justifications for your beliefs. Whereas I think for him, it's all about the pursuit of better explanations for why the world is the way it is and how it could be otherwise, and accepting that every explanation you ever have is eventually, by someone, going to be superseded by one that sort of fits reality, that much better. And so I really like that mindset of accepting that we're always in error and engage in the process of iterated refinement of our understanding. Optimist is, I consider myself an optimist in the sort of simple sense of the term. I see being an optimist as kind of like Pascal's wager, or similar arguments applying in the sense that whether or not being optimistic turns out to be on my deathbed the correct stance, I think I'll have enjoyed life more along the way by choosing that path. But you can question the epistemic integrity of that at least a little bit. I also separately like Deutsch's sort of conception of optimism, that all problems are caused by a lack of knowledge. And again, that's a particular perspective on it, or maybe all problems that have solutions that are not forbidden by the laws of physics or something can be solved by having more knowledge, or the right knowledge. And I don't know, that's always the most helpful perspective to have on problems, but I think it is an underheld perspective on them. And I think there is a deep way in which that's true. And it was quite revelatory to me when I first heard it.
Great. Okay, final question. This is the question I ask everybody at the end, and this is especially for the high school students in the audience. What advice that is commonly given to teenagers do you think is actually wrong, and what would you replace it with?
I think what advice I was given as a teenager.
Or that you have heard given to other teenagers, or given generally, you know, common wisdom for teens that's should be upended.
A thing that I worry a bit about like realizing or thinking of oneself too soon as precocious or you know, super talented, in that, you know, if one is super talented, probably you know, maybe you start to kind of realize that at age 13, but there's still just an awful lot that you need to learn, and I sometimes worry that it's easy to encourage people to kind of skip over the learning that, you know, should in fact or sort of needs to happen. And there's maybe a flip side to some of these kind of gifted youth programs where, you know, do they, like, I guess it probably depends on the individual, but do they kind of make you think, man, I'm sort of capable of more than I thought, or do they make you think, man, do they make you think that you're sort of even more capable than you in fact are? And you know, I myself am a huge believer in what teenagers can do, and in fact, on the advice of my website, I try to, you know, encourage teenagers to you know, in general, upgrade their estimation of themselves. And I think for me, that was something that that I had to hear, and I was lucky enough some people told me. But for the teenagers who are here, and in fact, you know, who are lucky enough to have discovered your course, I think maybe they should also just be wary of potential overcorrection, and that if you're in fact a teenager listening to this, there probably are 5 or 10 more years of knowledge acquisition, of understanding, deepening, that you should engage in before, you know, potentially committing to I don't know, definitive courses of action.
All right, great. And just so everybody knows, Patrick has a website, patrickcollison.com, where he has a bunch of links and writings, including an advice page for teens, basically. And he has promised to write the advice for what, 20, for people in their 20s once he hits 35 to 40, which I don't even know when that is.
And well, not even then, maybe. That just it definitely feels premature right now.
And you can also follow him on Twitter at Patrick C. Patrick, anywhere else that you would like people to follow you, or can?
No, God, my website and Twitter is, for most people, probably already too much.
Okay, great. So let's go to some questions from the audience. We have, and we'll do that for the next 15 minutes or so. All right, we're giving first priority to some questions from our enrolled students, which are coming to me through a separate channel. One of them is, what do you think about the future of the internet as rate of adoption is slowing? Do you see it becoming increasingly zero-sum / less spending on R&D? Like, I guess my interpretation of this is, if you think of the long waves of technology, and you think that computing as a long wave is maybe starting to plateau, then, you know, what does that imply for sort of like opportunities in computing and technology and investment there versus maybe future fields?
Well, 2 points, but I don't actually know, I don't know that I have a strong overall view on the question. One is, as the internet becomes increasingly deeply enmeshed with society and the economy, I think we are still in the early stages of that deployment. I think that's kind of the relevant lens through which to analyze it. And I mean, at Stripe, we see so many businesses where they are taking some kind of traditional sleepy sector and building the software-enabled, software upgraded version of it. And in the full space of possibilities there, I think we're still very early. Second thing is, we're still just so bad at building software. Our software sucks, our tools for building software sucks. And maybe for some deep cognitive reasons or something, we can't do very substantially better than we currently are. I hope that's not true, and my strong supposition is that it's not true. And so the sense that we're somehow kind of plateauing, we're somehow maximizing that which is possible, just feels misguided to me. It still feels to me that we're building MS-DOS programs, and there are still many, many layers beyond that which we're currently realizing.
Still day one.
Yes.
Great. Okay, another question. Some people have suggested a Manhattan project for COVID-19. Is that what Fast Grants is doing? If not, is something like that, a Manhattan or Apollo project, even feasible anymore?
I suspect it's not feasible. I think there was a kind of, a combination of sort of a fealty to the government / big systems of the mid-century, plus, I mean, an actual world war that, much and all as COVID is a major crisis, I think, it does not quite rise to that level of sort of perceived urgency. And so I think for both of those reasons, you could not actually corral all the best people and get them to move to New Mexico. Is that what Fast Grants is trying to do? I mean, it depends what you mean by Manhattan Project. Are we trying to better enable the best people? Yes, absolutely. Are we trying to get them all to work closely together as part of a single coordinated hierarchical project? No. We have no Robert Oppenheimer. Fortunately, I think, I mean, time will tell, but I think that simply enabling the best people will actually prove sufficient.
Great. You mentioned that the existential risk that comes with more progress could be mitigated. What do we need to do to mitigate those risks? Are there general philosophies that protect us, or is it a question of specific measures in various fields?
I don't know. I've wondered about it quite a bit, and I've read. I mean, this is, as probably a lot of folks here know, something that top scientists and others wrote about, sort of mostly starting with the aftermath of the Second World War, because it was obviously so kind of salient a question after the atom bomb. I don't know yet.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so somebody is reacting to your advice to keep learning, another 5 to 7 years before committing to a career direction, and is pointing out, well, that's not what you did. You went ahead and started a company when you were very young. So just paraphrasing, what gives? That's not how he phrased it, but
right. All I said was to kind of be wary of it, and I think that, I actually went back to college after starting my first company because of this sort of concern. I thought I had not learned enough. And I went back to study physics, and I then decided, sort of for separate reasons, that physics wasn't the right field for me, kind of for two reasons. One, I didn't think that I was as good as the best people in physics. And also I thought that even if I was, we didn't seem to be at a particularly kind of, propitious time for great physics discoveries to be made. Like even the very best people weren't made. I mean, I think it was Bohr said that in the 20s was a time where second-rate physicists could do first-tier work. Whereas it seemed to me that, when I was in college, that even if I was a first-tier physicist, I would in fact struggle to do second-tier work. There are certain kinds of, I don't think you should conclude too much from my particular trajectory. There are certain kinds of innovations that were foreclosed to me because, in a sense, I stopped fairly early. And anything in biotech, certainly wasn't, and may not be or won't be, certainly unless I go and spend an awful long time learning in the future. And so I think maybe with software, it's kind of more forgiving for various reasons for folks who have not acquired a whole lot of formal knowledge. And if you're sure that's the path you want to follow, maybe that's fine. But basically, you're actually pruning quite a few branches from the search space. And again, that could be fine, but I think you want to be cognizant that it is in fact what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Let's see. I am going to, we've got a lot of questions and probably won't be able to get to all of them in the next 8 minutes. So I'm going to sift, filter, and interpret a little bit. There's a couple of questions on the general theme of big companies getting big, needing effective organizational structures and hierarchies, and how to avoid maybe getting, sort of more inefficient and less innovative. As you have been growing Stripe for many years now and have seen it grown from 2 people to many people, like what are your thoughts on this? And maybe you can tell us if there's just any innovative things you've done within Stripe to sort of keep it, still day one, keep it innovative and nimble.
I think the correlation between size and innovativeness is kind of sort of present, but imperfect in that, most small organizations are actually highly, non-innovative. And of course, if you sort of, if you take the kind of selection bias of the innovative small organizations, maybe they look good, compared to the big ones, but the most innovative parts of certain big ones will actually look very innovative if you allow yourself kind of equivalent cherry picking, within the larger entities. So anyway, I think there's some questions of kind of how exactly the comparison should be constructed. In a sense, not all, but a simple-minded view on the problem that I think is not necessarily totally wrong is, are you attracting really innovative people? And how enabled are they? And those are 2 questions that John and I spend a lot of our time thinking about. And you can't measure the human capital of an organization by headcount. So what's the right composition? What kinds of innovative thinking do we in fact need? On which axes is it most important for us to innovate? And then we try to do a lot of, both for Stripe as a product, but also for Stripe as an organization, a lot of customer interviews. Just for people who have good ideas, how difficult or straightforward is it for them to get them realized? And not only is this is something that I obsess over, but it's something that a lot of others at Stripe also take really seriously. In fact, someone at Stripe told me, I guess it was, in fact, this week, that he sees his core job as maximizing the fraction of the time that someone really innovative at the company can go and, in fact, realize their idea. I don't want to kind of say too much about other companies because, in a sense, I've never worked at any others or never worked at any others at any scale. But I suspect just pursuing those 2 questions could actually get you a long way.
Yep. Okay, another question from one of our students. Basically, how did you just found a company? How did you know where to start and what to do? Well, we kind of just did, and both of my parents were entrepreneurs in the sense that my mom actually started a corporate training company shortly after I was born,
Our dad, he ran a hotel when we were growing up, and then he kind of got into property development. And so we thought when we were young that being an entrepreneur was just a normal thing. Like probably if your parents are astronauts, you think that your parents being astronauts is like the normal thing to do. If your parents are farmers, then you think being a farmer is a normal thing. And so when we were 5-year-olds, playing in the garden, we were playing at starting companies just because that was just what you did. And so some of it was just, well, you Google, incorporate company and sort of follow the instructions. We're also lucky that early on we got to know, I actually known through programming Paul Graham, and then when he started Y Combinator, kind of got to know him in that context as well. And YC helped us with both of the companies that we started, and that was certainly very helpful. But kind of just doing it can actually get you surprisingly far.
Yes. What do you think about studying liberal arts if you're in college for technology?
I would probably, I think culture is hugely important. And if one, views liberal arts in some ways as a study of and determinant to some extent of culture, I think it's a hugely important topic. I think you'd really want to make sure that you're studying the right works and sort of the right philosophies in order to, like, it's a bit like saying, well, should you, right analogy, should you study art? It kind of depends on like which art, and I guess our art maybe does not have instrumental purpose, necessarily. Depending on your purpose, it could, but if it's just kind of aesthetic appreciation, maybe it doesn't matter as much which kinds of art you study. So I guess maybe it depends on why the questioner is asking. But in as much as somebody here in a progress studies conversation is asking about studying liberal arts, I think making sure you're studying the right works is probably the key question. And again, it's not that I definitively know what they are, but just being very thoughtful about that. But if you have some theory as to how you can identify the right work, ideally a kind of unique perspective on that, then I think it could be super high return. Like, I was wondering just today, it would be so interesting, and maybe this exists. I would love a pointer if it does, but like, the Song dynasty in China and like the Mughal Empire in India and various European kind of Enlightenment cultures, like they're all in their different ways really productive. And has anyone sort of done a study of the commonalities and differences across, whatever the author identifies to be, really innovative, productive cultures? Again, maybe that exists and would love to read it if so. I strongly agree that a kind of liberal arts perspective on some of these questions would be and is very valuable. Yeah, agree. Okay, great. Well, I think we are just about at the bottom of the hour, and I don't want to keep you any longer. I'm sure you have a ton of work to do, and maybe even meetings. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for being here. I'm sure we could have talked another hour and had a great conversation. Maybe you will come back and join us again sometime in the future. Thank you so much for having me. All right. Have a good one. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And if you haven't applied to Progress Studies for Young Scholars, please go to progressstudies.school and check it out. Thanks, everybody.